She came west expecting a gentleman and found a stranger in a worn coat. What she couldn't know, what nearly cost her everything, was that the man standing on that platform would become the greatest love of her life. But first, she would have to survive her own judgment. If you've ever written someone off too soon, this story is for you. Stay until the very end, and drop a like, and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. The train pulled into Casper with a long, exhausted groan, as though the locomotive itself had spent everything it had crossing the high plains of Wyoming and needed a moment to collect itself before the world could ask anything more of it. Vivian Ashcroft stood at the window of her passenger car and watched the town materialize through the dirty glass. A cluster of low wooden buildings pressed together against a gray November sky. The streets nothing but churned mud and horse tracks. A hand-painted sign above a general store that had started to peel at one corner. She had been watching the landscape change for 3 days, watching Philadelphia's row houses and gas-lit avenues give way to Ohio farmland, then the endless brown flatness of the plains, and finally this. Wyoming. The end of everything familiar. She picked up her gloves from the seat beside her and pulled them on, one finger at a time, taking longer than necessary. The letter was still in her traveling bag. She didn't need to reread it. She'd memorized most of it by the second month of their correspondence. I am not a man given to poetry, Gideon Mercer had written in October of last year, his handwriting careful and slanted slightly to the right. But I find myself wanting to describe the sky out here to you, and I'm not sure I have the words for it. It goes on longer than seems right, longer than anything should. I thought you might find that interesting, or possibly disturbing. Either reaction seems honest. She had laughed out loud reading that, alone in her sitting room in her father's house, with the evening paper still folded in her lap. It was the kind of sentence a man wrote when he was genuinely thinking, not performing. She had read enough letters from performing men to know the difference. Over 12 months, they had exchanged 41 letters. He described the ranch, 300 acres in the Platte River Valley, cattle operation, 2 hired hands, a house he was slowly making less drafty. He described the work plainly, without boasting. He asked her questions that suggested he'd read her previous letter more than once. He disagreed with her, sometimes sharply, and never apologized for it. When she wrote that she found most men's interest in politics to be theater rather than genuine conviction, he'd written back, "That may be true of most men in Philadelphia. I wouldn't know. But the decisions made in Washington affect whether I can feed my cattle through a hard winter or not, so I tend to take politics somewhat more personally than theater." She had read that paragraph 3 times and felt something shift in her chest. She was 26 years old. She had turned down 2 proposals from men her father approved of. She had a mind that her mother called inconvenient and her tutors called exceptional. And she had spent most of her adult life being told in various polite ways to use it less visibly. Gideon Mercer, whoever he was, had never once suggested she should be any quieter. So she had said yes. And she had packed 4 trunks and boarded a train and come 3 days west to marry a man she had never seen. The passenger car lurched to a final stop. Vivian stood, smoothed her traveling dress, dark green wool, practical, nothing she'd wear in Philadelphia society but sensible for a journey of this kind, and moved toward the door. The conductor held it open for her at the platform steps, and she stepped down into the cold Wyoming air and immediately felt it on her face like a hand pressing flat against her skin. The wind here had an edge to it that Philadelphia's winter wind didn't, something harder in it, less willing to be ignored. She scanned the platform. There were perhaps a dozen people waiting, a family reuniting noisily near the far end, a freight worker pushing a dolly, a woman in a gray coat reading something, and then a man standing alone, holding his hat against the wind with one hand, watching the passengers step off the train. She knew it was him before she could have explained why. Something in the stillness of him. He wasn't fidgeting the way a man waiting for a woman he'd agreed to marry might be expected to fidget. She stopped walking. He was tall. That part matched her imagination, if she was honest. But almost nothing else did. The coat he wore was clearly working gear, brown canvas, the left elbow patched with a different material, the collar turned up against the wind. His beard was full and dark, and had not been shaped by any barber she could imagine. His face was weathered, not in the distinguished way a man of 40 sometimes was, but in the way of someone who spent most of his time outside whether he wanted to or not. He was looking directly at her now, and he did not smile exactly, though something in his expression changed when their eyes met. A slight relaxing, maybe, as though he'd been holding something cautiously and had now decided to set it down. He crossed the platform toward her. "Miss Ashcroft," he said. His voice was lower than she'd expected, and there was no flourish to it. "I'm Gideon Mercer. I hope the journey wasn't too hard." She looked at him. She couldn't help it. She was doing what she'd trained herself not to do, which was assess people rapidly and thoroughly the moment she saw them. And what she was assessing was, this man looks nothing like his letters. It was 3 days, she said. It was adequate. A pause. If he was bothered by the flatness of that, he didn't show it. "I've got a wagon. Your bags, the conductor will bring them out." She glanced back at the car. "There are 4 trunks." Something crossed his face. Not irritation exactly, more like quiet arithmetic. He nodded. "I'll get them." He turned and walked toward the baggage car without another word, and Vivian stood on the platform in the November wind and tried to locate, somewhere in her chest, the feeling she had expected to have when she finally met him. The feeling of recognition, of arriving somewhere she'd been traveling toward. She found nothing of the kind. What she found instead was a cold, clear thought, sharp as the air itself. "I have made a terrible mistake." She said nothing of this on the drive out of Casper. The wagon was a working vehicle, a flatbed with a bench seat at the front, practical and unadorned. One of his horses, a gray mare, had a healing wound on her foreleg that had been bandaged competently. Vivian noticed these details the way she noticed most things, filing them without meaning to. The road west was dirt, barely deserving of the name. The town gave way quickly to open grassland, and then there was nothing but the long, flat reach of the territory under a heavy white sky, with the suggestion of mountains far to the west, barely visible, more like a rumor of mountains than actual ones. Gideon drove with one hand loose on the reins, relaxed in the way of a man who'd made this drive 1,000 times and didn't need to think about it. He had put his hat back on. From the side, in profile, he looked harder than she wanted him to look. "How far is the ranch?" she asked. "About 14 miles, give or take." "How long will that take?" "Hour and a half? Maybe 2, with the load." She looked straight ahead at the road. "You're disappointed," he said. Not a question. She turned to look at him. He was still watching the road, expression unchanged. "I don't know what you mean," she said. "Yes, you do." He said it without heat. "It's fine. Most people who come out here from the east have a picture in their heads. The picture's usually wrong." "I didn't say anything about—" "You didn't have to." He glanced at her briefly. "Your face is very honest, Miss Ashcroft. I expect that's been inconvenient for you at times." She didn't answer, which was itself an answer. He faced the road again. The wagon rocked over a rut, and she grabbed the bench edge with one hand. He didn't seem to feel it. "I should tell you," she said finally, "that I am not the kind of woman who—" She stopped, started again. "My father thought this was a mistake. My mother thought it was worse than that. I want you to understand that I came here in good faith." "I know that, and I intend to honor the arrangement we made, regardless of—" She stopped again. "Regardless of what you found when you got here," he said quietly. She said nothing. "That's fair enough," he said. "I'm not asking you to feel any particular way about any of it. We made an agreement. I'll hold to my end." He looked at her again just for a moment. "I just ask that you give the place a fair look before you decide anything." It was a strange thing to say, "before you decide anything," as though he already understood the calculation she was running, as though he'd expected it. "I'll give it a fair look," she said stiffly. He nodded once and returned his attention to the road, and they drove the rest of the way in silence, with the wind pushing across the open land and the sky getting lower and grayer overhead, and Vivian Ashcroft sitting upright on the wagon bench beside this stranger who was technically her husband and thinking, with a precision that years of careful education had given her, about how quickly she might be able to arrange a return to Philadelphia. The ranch was not what she'd feared, which was something. She had prepared herself, on the drive out, for a shack. What she found instead was a substantial two-story frame house, unpainted but solid, covered porch along the front and real glass windows, which she knew enough by now to understand was not a given out here. There were 2 barns, both well-maintained, and a series of fenced pastures extending east toward a tree line, and beyond that the low hills of the valley. A dog met them in the yard, a large, brindle-colored thing with a torn ear, and it went immediately to Gideon's side and walked with him like it had been doing so its entire life. "His name is Hector," Gideon said, though she hadn't asked. "He won't bother you." He helped her down from the wagon, which she accepted without comment. His hands were rough. She felt it even through her gloves, and he let go the moment her feet were on the ground. Inside, the house was plain but clean. A main room with a fireplace, a table, and 4 chairs, a wood stove in the corner that was radiating heat with welcome steadiness. Shelves along one wall, half of them books. She looked at the books, and some of the tension in her chest eased fractionally. She wasn't sure why. "Your room is upstairs," he said. "Second door on the left. Mine's at the end. I had Mrs. Halsey. She works in Casper. She helped me get the house set before you came. I had her put fresh linens on." "Thank you," Vivian said. She wasn't sure what else to say. "I'll get your trunks." She stood alone in the main room while he went back outside, and she looked around at the walls, the low ceiling with its visible beams, the window above the sink that looked out at the nearest barn, and she thought, "This is my life now." The thought arrived without sentiment, just the plain fact of it, like a stone placed in her palm. The first 2 weeks were a negotiation conducted almost entirely in silence. She cooked competently, if not enthusiastically, because it was expected, and because the alternative was watching Gideon make the same thing every morning, which appeared to be salt pork and biscuits produced with a kind of grim efficiency that suggested he'd been eating this way for years without complaint or curiosity. She made a proper soup on the 3rd day, using the vegetables she found in the root cellar, and he ate it without comment, which she initially read as indifference and later, much later, realized was simply his way of not making a production of things. He worked from before dawn to past dark. She could hear him in the mornings before she came downstairs. The soft sounds of a man moving through a dark house who'd learned not to wake people, the creak of the back door, and then silence. In the evenings he came in, washed at the pump, sat down to eat, and after dinner he read. Not newspapers, though he took those too. Books. Heavy ones, with broken spines. She asked him once, toward the end of the first week, what he was reading. He held the cover out for her to see. Capital, by Karl Marx. She looked at him. "I don't agree with most of it," he said, "but you learn more from the things you argue with than the things you agree with." She sat down across the table from him. "Where did you find that out here?" "Traded for it in Casper 2 years ago. Some traveling teacher was selling off his books." He turned a page. "I've read most of them twice." She looked at the shelves again, more carefully this time. Mill, Tocqueville, a set of Shakespeare, battered, a natural history of birds in 2 volumes, a surveying manual, Hard Times by Dickens. Several she couldn't make out from across the room. "You didn't mention the books in your letters," she said. He looked up. "You didn't ask." "I asked about your interests. I said I was interested in cattle prices and water rights." That was the first letter. A slight pause. "I suppose I didn't think of it as something to mention. Reading's just something I do." She sat with that for a moment. "Most men I knew in Philadelphia talked about their reading constantly," she said, "usually at considerable length." "That sounds exhausting," he said, without looking up from the page. Despite herself, she almost smiled. She wrote to her friend Margaret Holloway in Philadelphia on the 12th day. She sat at the table after Gideon had gone out to do the morning feeding, with the fire going and her tea getting cold beside her, and she tried to explain in honest terms what she had found. "The man is not what I expected," she wrote. "In appearance, in manner, in almost everything practical. He says very little. He works constantly. The country is enormous and indifferent in a way that Philadelphia is not, and I won't pretend I don't feel the difference." She stopped writing, looked at the window, looked at the shelves. "I am not unhappy," she continued, "which I admit surprises me. I am not happy either. I am suspended, watching. I don't know yet what I'm watching for." She sealed the letter and addressed it and put it in her coat pocket to take to Casper the next time Gideon went in for supplies. In the third week, she found the ledger. She wasn't snooping. She had asked him the evening before whether there was any record keeping she might help with because she'd noticed he came in late on the first of the month and sometimes sat at the table after dinner with papers spread out, working the numbers with the focused expression of a man solving a problem that didn't have a clean solution. He'd said she could look at the ledger if she wanted. It was on the shelf, second shelf, green cover. She took it down and spent the better part of 2 hours with it at the table, and by the end she had a clear and not entirely encouraging picture of where things stood. The ranch was not failing, but it was running closer to the margin than it should have been, and she could see why. The beef prices Gideon was getting from the Casper buyer were below market rate, not dramatically, but consistently, every transaction for the past 2 years, by a margin that added up. She cross-referenced the dates with the commodity prices she found in the stack of old newspapers he kept near the stove, and by the time she was done, the pattern was unmistakable. Someone was shorting him. She put the ledger down and sat very still for a moment. Then she put her coat on and went to find him. He was in the near barn, working on a piece of harness leather with an awl and some thread, doing the kind of careful mending that prevented expensive replacements. He looked up when she came in. "There's a problem with your beef prices," she said. He kept his hands moving on the leather. "I know." She stopped. "You know. Hanson, the Casper buyer. He's been doing it for 2 years, about 8 cents below market, consistent." He didn't look up. "I've been working out how to deal with it." "Have you considered simply selling to a different buyer?" "There is no different buyer in Casper." "There's a buyer in Cheyenne." Now he did look up. "He's farther," she said, "but if you factor in the price difference and the cost of the longer drive, you break even in the first year and come out ahead in the second, assuming you drive twice a year, which the ledger suggests you do." She paused. "I worked it out. I can show you the numbers." He studied her for a moment. The lamplight in the barn caught the edge of his expression. Not surprise, exactly. Something more careful than surprise. "Show me," he said. She showed him. He looked at her numbers for a long time without speaking, and she sat across the table from him and tried not to appear as though she was waiting for him to tell her she'd made an error. She hadn't made an error, and she knew it, but there was something in the way he considered things. Slowly, thoroughly, with the kind of patience she associated with men who'd been fooled before, and had decided never to be fooled the same way twice. That made her feel strangely uncertain. "You're right," he said at last. "I know," she said. And then immediately, "I'm sorry, that was—" "No, you're right about that too," he said, the corner of his mouth moving very slightly. "No reason to apologize for being right." He looked at the numbers again. "The Cheyenne Drive. We'd need one more hand. That's a cost." "I included that." He looked. "So you did." He tapped the page once with his finger. "I'll write to the Cheyenne buyer this week. I can draft the letter if you want. I'm better at—" She stopped herself. "Better at what?" "Written negotiation," she said carefully. He looked at her steadily. "Then draft it," he said. "I'll read it and tell you if anything needs changing." She had expected resistance. She wasn't sure why. He'd never actually shown her much resistance to anything. But she'd been waiting for it, the way you wait for a door to stick even after it's been rehung, because it used to stick. "All right," she said. She drafted the letter that evening. It was good. She knew it was good. The kind of professional correspondence that asked for what it wanted without appearing to demand, that established credibility without boasting, that left the recipient feeling the arrangement benefited them as much as it benefited the sender. She slid it across the table to him when she was done. He read it twice. She watched him read. His lips didn't move, which she'd noticed about him. He read the way he did everything, contained, with nothing wasted. "It's good," he said. "One thing, I'd change this part." He pointed to a paragraph midway through. "You wrote 'we anticipate.' I'd write 'we expect.' This man's a cattle buyer. He thinks 'anticipate' is something women say." She looked at the paragraph. She did not love the suggestion, but she also recognized that he was probably right about the buyer, and that being probably right about the buyer was more relevant than her preference for the word. "Fine," she said. "I'll change it." He nodded. Otherwise, it's better than anything I would have written. She looked up. I write clear, he said. Not persuasive. He pushed the letter back to her. You write persuasive. She wasn't sure, later, when she was upstairs in her room with the lamp turned low, what to make of that. It was a compliment. She'd received compliments before, from men who gave them the way they gave tips, reflexively, expecting a specific reaction, waiting to see if it had worked. This hadn't been that. This had been a man stating a fact about her that he found useful. She wasn't sure why that felt like more. In the 4th week, she rode the property for the first time. Gideon had offered, in his way, which was to say he'd mentioned that the gray mare, whose name was Nell, was well-mannered and knew the land, and that the eastern fence line was worth having a look at this time of year. She'd understood the offer and accepted it. She rode east along the fence line in the cold morning with Nell moving steadily beneath her, and Hector ranging ahead through the dry grass, and she tried to think about Philadelphia. She did this deliberately sometimes, the way you press a bruise to see if it still hurts. She thought about her mother's parlor and the smell of the library at the Athenaeum and the sound the city made in the morning, the layered sound of 100,000 people and their machinery. She thought about Margaret Holloway and their Tuesday afternoons and the particular pleasure of conversation with someone who pushed back. She was surprised to find that the Philadelphia-shaped ache, which had been sharp in the first week, had already softened somewhat. She wasn't sure what to do with that information. The eastern fence line was intact for the most part, but she found 2 sections where the posts had heaved from the freeze-thaw cycle and would need resetting before spring. She noted the locations carefully, counting fence posts from the corner, the way she'd seen Gideon do it, and turned Nell back toward the ranch. Coming back, she crested a low rise and the valley opened up below her, the ranch buildings small and clear in the middle distance, smoke coming from the chimney of the house in a thin, white vertical line. The sky above was a flat, pale blue, and the mountains to the west were white at the top now, the snow line lower than it had been a week ago. She sat still for a moment with Nell blowing warm air into the cold and Hector sitting at the edge of the rise, looking out, and she thought about the word home, what it meant, whether it was a place or something more fungible than that, whether it could be acquired or only recognized. She wasn't arriving at any conclusions, but she realized, not unhappy. She rode down the rise and into the yard and found Gideon coming out of the far barn. East fence has 2 bad posts, she said, about 400 yards from the corner, and another maybe 200 yards past that. He looked at her, something careful in his expression that she was starting to be able to read. You counted the posts? It seemed useful. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but approaching one. It is useful, he said. She dismounted and led Nell toward the near barn. After a moment, she heard him fall into step beside her. I can get to those posts next week, he said, before the ground freezes harder. I thought so. That's why I went today. A pause. Thank you, he said. She glanced at him. He was looking straight ahead at the barn, hands in his coat pockets. You're welcome, she said, and meant it more than she'd expected. On the last Sunday of November, she came downstairs at 7 in the morning and found him already at the table with coffee and a piece of paper, writing something in his careful, slanted hand. He looked up when she came in. Letter from my brother came yesterday, he said, from back east. He's having some trouble. She poured herself coffee and sat down. What kind of trouble? He hesitated. Not the hesitation of someone deciding whether to lie, but the other kind. The kind where you're deciding whether to say a difficult thing plainly or find a way around it. He borrowed money from the wrong man, Gideon said, a creditor in Baltimore. The terms were... He looked at the letter. The terms weren't what he was told they were. She wrapped both hands around her cup. What are the terms now? He owes more than he can pay. They're pressing him. A pause. Hard. How much? He told her. She didn't let her expression change, though it was a serious number. Can you? She began. Not the whole amount. Not right now. He set down the pen. I was going to send him what I can, but it won't be enough. There may be a legal angle, she said. If the terms were misrepresented, that's fraud. He'd need a lawyer, but He can't afford a lawyer. He might not need much of one. If the original agreement can be shown to be fraudulent, a competent attorney could get the terms reconsidered, or get the creditor to settle for what was originally stated. She thought for a moment. I know a man in Philadelphia, an attorney, James Whitmore. My father used him occasionally. He's reputable, and he's not unreasonable about fees in cases he thinks have merit. Gideon looked at her. That careful expression again, but something different in it now. I could write to him, she said. Explain the situation. Ask him to correspond with your brother. Why would you do that? She was slightly surprised by the directness of the question. Because your brother is in trouble, she said, and I happen to know someone who might help. He was quiet for a moment. You don't owe him anything. You've never met him. No, she said, but he's your family. She picked up her coffee. You can tell me it's not my concern if you want to. It's not that. He looked at the letter again. His jaw moved slightly, the way it did when he was working something out. I'm not accustomed to it. He stopped. To what? To having someone offer to help, he said, without wanting something back for it. She set down her cup. The fire made its small sounds in the stove behind her. Gideon, she said, and it was the first time she'd used his given name without the formality of context, without it being attached to a question or a task, just his name on its own. He looked at her. We are, as it stands, married. Whatever the complications of that arrangement, we are living in the same house and working toward the same thing. Helping your family is not charity, it's practical. He held her gaze for a moment, then he looked back at the letter. Write to your attorney, he said quietly. If you're willing. I'm willing, she said. She got up to get more coffee, and she was aware, crossing back to the table, of a quality to the silence in the room that was different from what it had been for the past 4 weeks. Less like two people avoiding a conversation. More like two people deciding, independently and at the same time, that they were in the same room on purpose. The month of November ended with a snowstorm that closed the road to Casper for 4 days and reduced the world to the ranch, the barns, the yard, and the gray sky pressing down on all of it. Vivienne did not find the confinement intolerable, which surprised her. She read from his shelves, started with Tocqueville, which she'd been meaning to read for years, and she wrote 3 more letters to Philadelphia and 1 more to James Whitmore in detail. And in the evenings, she and Gideon sat on opposite sides of the table and sometimes talked and sometimes didn't. He was teaching her, without formally calling it that, the particular language of the land out here. What the sky looked like before a serious storm versus a passing one, which fence sections the wind hit hardest, how to read a cow's condition from a distance. He didn't instruct so much as mention, which was a method she appreciated. That section of pasture floods early in spring, good to know. Or, wind out of the northwest usually means something's coming. She wrote these things down in a small notebook she'd started keeping. One evening, she looked up from Tocqueville to find him watching her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before, or hadn't been able to read before. Something open in it, something that cost him something. Can I ask you something? He said. Yes, she said. The letters. He paused. Were they what made you decide to come? She thought about it honestly, the way she tried to do with everything. Yes, she said. The letters were... She looked for the right word. They were the kind of letters I had stopped believing men would write. He nodded, slowly, looking at the table. I didn't know how to explain in a letter what I looked like. She stared at him for a moment. Something in that sentence, the plainness of it, the quiet acknowledgement of what he knew she'd been thinking, moved through her like cold water, cold and then clearing. No, she said carefully. I don't suppose you did. I'm not... He touched the edge of the table with one finger. I know what people expect. Educated man, reads books, wrote the letters I wrote. They picture someone different. I did picture someone different, she said, and she kept her voice even because she thought the truth deserved honesty more than it deserved softening. I won't pretend otherwise. When I saw you on the platform, She stopped. You looked like you wanted to get back on the train, he said, and there was something in his voice that was almost amusement, and something else that wasn't. I thought about it, she said. He nodded. Didn't seem hurt by it exactly, but the nod carried weight. Gideon. She waited until he looked at her. The man who wrote those letters is the man I'm talking to right now. He was quiet for a long moment. The fire popped once in the stove. Hector, asleep near the door, stirred and settled again. Yes, he said at last. I know. And then, I just wasn't sure if you did yet. She said nothing after that, and neither did he, and the storm pressed against the windows and the lamp burned, and she looked down at the page of Tocqueville without reading it. And she thought about the word yet, and what it meant, and what it was going to mean. And she found that for the first time since she'd stepped off the train in Casper, she was not in any particular hurry to make any particular decision. She was, she realized, watching. Still watching. But now she thought she might be beginning to understand what she was watching for. December came in hard and without apology. The first real cold arrived on a Tuesday, not the sharp, dry cold of late November that Vivian had started to adjust to, but something deeper, something that settled into the walls of the house overnight, and was still there in the morning when she came downstairs and found the water in the basin near the window had a thin skin of ice across the top. She broke it with her knuckle and washed her face and told herself this was manageable. She had managed things before. She would manage this. Gideon was already outside. He was always already outside. She had started to accept this as a fixed condition of the world, like the mountains to the west, simply part of what was true about this place. She made coffee and stood at the window with her cup and watched him cross the yard from the near barn to the far one. Hector moving at his heel, both of them leaving tracks in the dusting of snow that had come down sometime before dawn. He moved the way he always did, not fast, not slow, the steady, purposeful pace of someone who understood that the work didn't end, and panicking about it didn't help. She had been watching him this way for 2 weeks now, adding to a running account she kept in the back of her mind. The way he handled the horses, firm, patient, no wasted motion. The way he spoke to his 2 hired hands, Tom Briggs and a younger man called Eddie, with the directness of someone who respected the people he was talking to enough not to waste their time with softening. The way he ate her cooking without comment that first week, which she'd read as indifference, and had since revised. He ate without comment because he'd been eating alone for years, and the habit of gratitude had no one to practice on. She was revising a lot of things. The letter from James Whitmore arrived in the first week of December, forwarded through the Casper Post. The attorney had read her account of Gideon's brother carefully, and he believed there was merit in the fraud claim. The terms as described constituted misrepresentation, possibly actionable. He asked for the original agreement and a list of dates and amounts paid. She wrote back the same day with instructions for what Gideon should ask his brother to send. She left the letter on the table for Gideon to read when he came in, and he read it standing up, still in his coat, and then he sat down and read it a second time more slowly, and she said nothing and poured him coffee and set it beside him. When he put the letter down, he said, Whitmore thinks he can get the original terms reinstated. He thinks he can argue for them. The creditor will likely settle to avoid the exposure. She sat down across from him. It's not certain, but it's better than where your brother was a week ago. Gideon looked at the letter a moment longer. Then he folded it and set it by his coffee cup. I'll write to Daniel tonight, he said. I can help you draft it if... I'll write it myself, he said, not unkindly. He's my brother. He should hear it in my words. Of course, she said, and she meant it. She'd overstepped and he'd corrected it cleanly without making her feel small for the offer. She was learning the texture of his corrections. They were rare, and when they came, they were specific and done. He picked up his coffee. Thank you, Vivian. She noticed, as she had noticed the other times he'd used her first name now, that it arrived differently than she'd expected names to arrive in this arrangement. Not with the studied warmth of a man performing intimacy, just her name, said plainly, meaning what it said. You're welcome, she said. They sat there with their coffee and the fire going in the stove, and outside the cold pressed against the windows, and neither of them said anything more about it, and Vivian thought this was somehow the most comfortable silence she'd sat in since she arrived. The trouble with Tom Briggs started small. He was the older of Gideon's 2 hands, mid-40s, lean, with a face that looked like it had been left out in too many seasons. He did his work without complaint, which Vivian understood was the standard out here, but there was something in the way he watched her that she didn't like. not threatening. She dealt with threatening. It was something more like dismissal, the particular variety that men sometimes had for women who asked questions about things men had decided women shouldn't ask about. She had asked him in the second week of December about the weight records for the last drive. She was cross-checking the ledger and she needed the individual animal weights, which Briggs kept in a small notebook he carried. He'd looked at her for a moment before answering. A beat too long. "I'll get those to Mr. Mercer," he said. "Mr. Mercer asked me to look at the records," she said, which was mostly true. Gideon had given her open authority over the books, which reasonably extended to this. "I just need the numbers." Another pause. "I'll check with him first," Briggs said, and walked away. She stood in the yard and watched him go with a flat, cold feeling in her chest that had nothing to do with the temperature. She didn't say anything to Gideon about it that evening. She thought about it, ran through the conversation, considered how to frame it, and decided she didn't know yet whether it was worth raising or whether it would resolve itself. She had grown up watching her mother raise things with her father, watching how those conversations landed and what they cost, and she had learned a specific caution about when to speak and when to let a situation show itself more fully. 2 days later, Briggs gave the numbers to Gideon, not to her. Gideon passed them to her at dinner without comment. She looked at the page and looked at him, and he held her gaze for a moment and something passed between them, acknowledgement without declaration, and she looked back at the numbers and wrote them into the ledger. Later, when they were washing up, he said, "Briggs is old-fashioned." "I noticed," she said. "I can talk to him." She thought about it. "Not yet," she said. "Let me handle it." He looked at her sideways. "How?" "By making it very clear over a reasonable period of time that I know what I'm doing." She dried her hands. Men like Briggs don't change because they're told to. They change because they can't argue with the evidence anymore. Gideon was quiet for a moment. "That takes patience." "I have patience," she said, "when it's worth using." He went back to what he was doing, and she thought she saw, reflected in the dark window above the sink, something that was beginning to look like a smile. She had her first real argument with Gideon in the middle of December. It started with the question of the south pasture and ended somewhere she hadn't expected. She had been looking at the grazing patterns in the ledger, not just this year's, but the previous 3 years' records, which he kept in a wooden box under the shelf, and she'd noticed something. The south pasture was being rested every other year, which was reasonable range management, but the rotation he was using meant it was always rested in a drought year, which was the one time you wanted it grazed because the other pastures dried out faster. She'd done the arithmetic 3 different ways and arrived at the same conclusion each time. The rotation was backwards. She brought it to him at dinner on a Wednesday. She explained it clearly, showed him the numbers, the pattern, the logic. She was careful, not condescending, not tentative, just clear. She thought she'd pitched it well. He listened without interrupting, which he always did. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The south pasture floods in wet years," he said. "If I graze it heavy in a wet year and it floods, I've damaged the sod, and I've got cattle stuck in mud. The rotation accounts for that." She had not known about the flooding. She felt the flaw in her argument open up like a fault line. "How often does it flood?" she asked. "Serious flood? Maybe 1 year in 4, bad enough to matter. Maybe 1 in 3. Then the expected value of the rotation still depends on—" She stopped. Ran the numbers again in her head, this time with the flooding factored in. The answer shifted, though not completely. "You'd still come out ahead grazing it in drought years if the flood risk is 1 in 4. If the flood's a wet year flood, yes. If it comes in early spring when the ground's still frozen underneath, it's worse." He looked at her steadily. "I've been watching that pasture for 8 years. She looked at the ledger. She looked at him. The frustration of being partially wrong when she'd been so certain she was fully right was a specific kind of unpleasant she was not accustomed to. "You could have told me about the flooding," she said, "when I first started looking at the grazing records." "You didn't ask about the flooding," he said. "You asked about the rotation. You knew what I was looking at." "I did," he said, "but I wanted to see where you'd get to on your own." She set down the ledger. "That's not—" She stopped herself. "Not what?" She considered what she was about to say. That's not a very efficient way to share information, she said, which was more measured than what she'd been about to say. No, he agreed. But it told me something useful to think. She looked at him. The fire crackled behind her. And what did it tell you? That you work problems all the way to the end before you bring them. He reached across the table and tapped the ledger. Most people bring the half-finished version. You bring the completed argument. That's worth knowing. A pause. Also that you don't like being wrong. Nobody likes being wrong. Some people like being right more than they like being accurate, he said. You'd rather be accurate. I noticed that. She stared at him for a moment. She wasn't sure whether she was still irritated or whether she had crossed some invisible line into something else. You were testing me, she said. I was learning you, he said, and the distinction he was drawing was clear enough that she didn't argue it. She picked up the ledger. The rotation is still suboptimal in 3 out of 4 years, she said. Probably, he said. Tell me what you do instead, with the flooding factored in. She told him. He pushed back on 2 points. She defended one and conceded the other. They arrived, 45 minutes later, at a modified rotation that was better than what he'd been using and more defensible than what she'd proposed. And somewhere in the middle of that 45 minutes, Vivian stopped being irritated and started being, she wasn't sure what. Engaged. Genuinely, thoroughly engaged in the problem and the person across the table, in a way she hadn't been in a conversation in longer than she wanted to calculate. When they were done, she poured them both more coffee without being asked, which she realized she'd started doing without thinking about it sometime in the past week, and she said, in Philadelphia, if you disagree with a man in his own house, he usually finds a way to end the conversation. Gideon wrapped both hands around his cup. How? Various methods, changing the subject, appealing to authority, his own, usually, waiting until you've talked long enough and then agreeing in a way that makes clear the agreement is a favor he's granting. He turned the cup slightly in his hands. That sounds like a waste of everyone's time. It is, she said. It always was. He looked at her across the table with that careful, open expression she was starting to be able to read. I'm not interested in being right, he said. I'm interested in the ranch doing well. Those aren't the same thing. No, she said. They aren't. She drank her coffee and thought about that. The cleanness of it, the straightforwardness. She thought about the men she'd known in Philadelphia who had confused those two things so completely that the confusion had become invisible to them, had become just the way things worked, as natural as weather. She thought about how long it had taken her to find a man who hadn't made that confusion. And she thought about how, for most of the first 3 weeks she'd been here, she'd been planning to leave him. Thus, Christmas came and went quietly. Gideon had not made anything of the holiday in years. She understood this without his saying it, the way she was coming to understand a number of things about him. He was not a man who marked occasions with ceremony, but she baked a spiced cake on Christmas Eve, using dried apples and what was left of the cinnamon, and when she put it on the table, he looked at it for a moment before he sat down, and she thought she saw something pass across his face, brief, unguarded, that she filed away carefully without commenting on. He gave her something that morning, left it on the table before she came down, a small, flat package wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a writing set, a good pen, 2 bottles of ink, a sheaf of heavy writing paper. Simple, practical, exactly what she needed and hadn't asked for. She turned the pen over in her hands and thought about the fact that he'd had to think about her specifically to choose this, that he'd paid attention. Thank you, she said when he came in from morning chores. He pulled off his coat. You were almost out of paper, I noticed. She set the pen down carefully. You notice a great deal, she said. He hung up his coat, said nothing for a moment, then, I paid attention in your letters too, what you valued, what mattered to you. He turned to face her. Writing mattered to you. It did, she said. It does. He nodded once and moved toward the stove for coffee, and she sat at the table with the pen in her hand and the winter light coming through the window and something moving in her chest that was warm and uncomfortable at the same time, the specific discomfort of realizing that someone had seen you more clearly than you'd seen them. The letter from Daniel Mercer arrived in late December, forwarded through Casper. It was addressed to both of them. Gideon read it first, and then passed it across the table without a word. She read it. Daniel wrote in a different hand than his brother, rounder, more open, less careful. And his relief was so evident in the words that it came off the page like heat. Whitmore had contacted the creditor's attorney. The original terms were being reviewed. There was, for the first time in months, something resembling hope. At the bottom, Daniel had written, "Gideon didn't tell me much about the woman he married, only that she was from Philadelphia and that she was smarter than him, which knowing Gideon means she must be something. I don't know how to thank you, Mrs. Mercer, except to say that I intend to." She folded the letter and handed it back. Gideon was watching her. "He likes to flatter," he said. "He's sincere," she said. "There's a difference." Like with anticipate and expect. She looked at him, and this time she did smile, fully, without calculating at first, which was not something she was accustomed to. And he looked slightly startled by it, as though the smile had arrived without warning and he hadn't had time to prepare an expression to meet it. "Yes," she said. Exactly like that. Pause. January came and the cold deepened into something absolute. There were days when Vivian looked out the window and the world was white in every direction, the sky and the ground the same color, the horizon erased, the ranch buildings standing in the middle of it like islands. On those days, the isolation was a physical presence in the house, something with weight and texture. She was not unused to being alone. She had been alone in many ways in Philadelphia, surrounded by people who didn't understand her. But this was a different kind of alone, and it required a different kind of accommodation. She wrote letters. She read. She went over the ledgers with a fine attention that was partly practical and partly a way of keeping her mind busy. She had found 2 more pricing discrepancies, not Hansen this time, but in the supply costs from Casper, 2 items that had been billed at rates above what the merchant's posted prices showed. She brought these to Gideon, who looked at them and said, with the quiet evenness he brought to most things, that he'd been wondering about those numbers for a while and hadn't had time to track them down. He handled the correction on his next trip to Casper, and the merchant, to his credit, corrected the invoices without argument, which told her Gideon's reputation in town was solid enough that the mistake had probably been genuine. But it was in January that something shifted between them, more permanently than the small shifts of November and December. It started with a night she couldn't sleep. She had been lying awake since about 2 in the morning, not the anxious sleeplessness of the first weeks, when she'd lain in the dark running escape routes, but a quieter kind, the kind where the mind just won't settle. She gave up on sleep around 3 and came downstairs in her heavy wool robe, intending to sit by the stove and read until she was tired enough to try again. Gideon was already there. He was at the table with a lamp, writing something, and he looked up when she came down the stairs, and neither of them said anything for a moment because the situation was slightly awkward. 2 people who shared a house but had been careful about the boundaries of that sharing, and here was a boundary neither of them had expected to encounter at 3 in the morning. "Couldn't sleep," she said. "No," he said. He didn't explain it, and she didn't ask. She went to the stove and found the coffee pot still had some warmth in it, not hot, but adequate. And she poured a cup and pulled the second chair closer to the stove rather than sitting at the table, because the table felt like interrupting him. She took her book from the shelf and sat down and opened it. For a while they were both quiet, the lamp making its small circle of light, the wind pressing at the walls outside, the stove ticking with heat. "What are you writing?" she asked, not looking up from the book. "Letter to a land agent in Cheyenne," he said. "There's a parcel east of us, about 40 acres, that's been sitting empty since the family that had it pulled out 3 years ago." A pause. "I've been thinking about it for a while. If the price is right, it would close the gap in the east fence line and give us another water source." She put the book down. "The creek that runs along the northeast corner?" He looked up. "You know it?" "I've ridden that way twice. The water looked clean and the flow seemed consistent." She thought for a moment. "What are they asking?" "I don't know yet. That's what I'm writing to find out. If it's below a certain number, it's worth it, even if you have to borrow for the difference." She did the calculation quickly, roughly, the way she did most calculations, in her head first, on paper, only if she needed to show it. Depending on what the water access does for summer grazing capacity. He was quiet for a moment. "I was going to figure that out after I knew the price." "You could figure it out now and know what number to hold at." He looked at her across the lamp. His expression was, she had no word for it exactly. It was the expression of a man who was being surprised by something he probably should have expected by now and wasn't entirely sure what to do with the feeling. "All right," he said. "What number?" She worked it through out loud, checking her assumptions against what she knew of the ledger and the grazing patterns and the cattle prices Gideon got from Cheyenne. He interrupted twice with corrections. The water table east of the creek was unreliable in dry years. The 40 acres included some rough ground that wouldn't graze as well as it looked from the road. She adjusted the calculation. They went back and forth for 20 minutes, lowering the acceptable price with each variable, until they arrived at a number that both of them looked at and agreed on with the same small nod, the way you nod when something clicks. Outside, the wind had died down some. The lamp threw their shadows large against the wall. "You should sleep," she said finally. "So should you." She looked at him. In the lamplight, his face looked different than it did in daylight. Less weathered, or the weathering less prominent, and she could see what he might have looked like before the territory got hold of him. Not softer, exactly. Just younger. "Gideon," she said. She hadn't planned to say anything, but the 3 in the morning and the lamplight and the months of revised impressions were all sitting in her chest at once, and she was not, at her core, a woman who left things unsaid forever. "I want you to know what I said in November about nearly getting back on the train. I've been reconsidering the accuracy of that first impression, substantially." He looked at her steadily. "Substantially," he repeated, and there was something in his voice that was warm and dry at the same time. Not quite amusement, but the elder sibling of it. "I don't do things halfway," she said, which came out more defensive than she intended. "No," he said, "you don't." He looked down at his letter. "I noticed that too." She pulled her robe tighter and picked her book back up, though she wasn't going to read it. "I'm going back to bed in a few minutes. I'll be up shortly." She sat there for another 10 minutes, not reading, listening to the pen move on paper and the stove doing its quiet work. And she thought about something Gideon had said back in November. "I just wasn't sure if you did yet." And she thought that the yet had arrived, quietly and without ceremony, the way most true things arrived in her experience, not with a flourish, just there one morning where it hadn't been before. When she finally stood to go back upstairs, she said goodnight, and he said goodnight back. And she climbed the stairs in the dark ranch house in the deep of a Wyoming January with the cold air settling around her, carrying something in her chest that was new and fragile and, she thought, probably worth protecting. The land agent's reply from Cheyenne came in the second week of February, and the number he quoted for the 40-acre parcel was lower than either of them had expected. Vivienne read the letter at the table while Gideon stood at the window with his coffee, watching the yard, which was his habit when he was thinking through something he hadn't decided yet. She looked at the number, looked at the calculation she'd written in her notebook that night in January by the lamp. The parcel was available at nearly $12 below the figure they'd settled on as the ceiling. "It's a good price," she said. "It is." He didn't turn from the window. "You're not sure." "I'm sure about the price." He turned the cup in his hands. "I'm less sure about the timing. Taking on the loan in late winter. If we have a bad spring, I'm carrying debt through the summer with reduced income. The probability of a bad spring after this winter is not something anybody can calculate," he said, not harshly, but with the flat certainty of someone who'd learned this the hard way. "This country doesn't follow arithmetic. I've seen 2 droughts follow 2 wet winters. I've seen the reverse." He finally turned from the window. "I'm not saying no. I'm saying I want to wait until I hear back from the Cheyenne buyer about the spring drive terms before I commit." She looked at him. He was right, and she knew he was right, and the fact that she'd been about to argue for the arithmetic irritated her slightly, because it was exactly the kind of argument he'd already identified as her weakness, working from the numbers without accounting for what the numbers couldn't contain. "When do you expect to hear from the buyer?" she asked. 2 weeks, maybe 3. "Then we wait," she said. He nodded and came back to the table and poured more coffee, and she watched him settle into his chair and pick up his own notebook. He kept one too, she'd noticed, the pages dense with figures and short notations in his slanted handwriting. And she thought, not for the first time, that she had spent most of her life around men who'd made a point of explaining things to her that she already understood. And here was a man who occasionally needed to explain things she genuinely hadn't considered. And the difference between those two experiences was something she still hadn't entirely absorbed. The weeks after the January night by the lamp had been different. Not dramatically. Nothing about Gideon was ever dramatic in the theatrical way. But there was less careful distance in it. They sat closer at the table in the evenings without the arrangement feeling formal. When they disagreed, and they disagreed often enough, the disagreements ended somewhere instead of just stopping. He asked her opinion on things before she offered it, which was new. She stopped waiting for the version of him she'd feared on the train platform to finally show up. Because it had been long enough now, and she understood that version wasn't coming. Tom Briggs remained the consistent complication. She had been patient with him, as she'd said she would be. She'd brought the financial corrections to Gideon's attention without going around Briggs in a way that would have forced a confrontation. She'd demonstrated, steadily and without performance, that she understood the operation, and Briggs had watched all of this with the fixed expression of a man waiting for a mistake he could point to. In early February, she gave him one. She had asked Eddie, the younger hand, who had none of Briggs's resistance and something of an earnest quality she found easy to work with, to move a small group of heifers from the near pasture to the south pasture 2 days early because the near pasture was getting cut up in the mud from the freeze-thaw, and she wanted to rest it. Eddie had done it without question. Briggs had found out and come to find her in the yard the following morning, and he did not look like a man coming to discuss a pasture rotation. "Those heifers need to stay on the near pasture through the end of the week," he said. "Mr. Mercer's always done it that way." She kept her voice level. "The near pasture is taking damage in this weather. Moving them 2 days early won't hurt the south pasture, and it'll save the sod on the near side." "Mr. Mercer's always done it that way," Briggs said again, as though the first time hadn't been sufficient. "I understand that. I changed it." His jaw tightened. "You changed it?" "Yes." She looked at him directly. "Do you have an objection to the move itself, or to the fact that I made it?" He was quiet for a moment. The yard was cold and gray around them, and Eddie was visible near the barn, pretending to be interested in a fence post. "You've been here 3 months," Briggs said. "I have. And in 3 months I've found 2 pricing errors in the supply invoices, renegotiated the beef contract, and identified a grazing rotation problem that was costing this ranch money every other year. The heifers are on the south pasture." She paused. "If you have a concern about any decision I make regarding this operation, you can bring it to Gideon. That's your right. But I'd appreciate it if you brought the concern before I've already made the decision, when it might be useful." Briggs looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a man who had not expected the conversation to go this direction and was reevaluating his strategy. He didn't say anything. He walked back toward the barn. She let out a slow breath and did not allow herself to feel triumphant, because it wasn't over and she knew it, and feeling triumphant was a way of relaxing a tension she couldn't afford to relax yet. She told Gideon about it that evening, this time without calculation, just told him plainly what had happened and what she'd said. He listened. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "How'd he look when he walked away?" he asked, like he was recalculating. "That's about right." He turned his coffee cup. "Briggs has been with me 6 years. He's a good hand, but he's got a picture in his head of how things work. And the picture doesn't have a woman in it who knows what she's doing." I gathered that. "He'll come around," Gideon said. "Or he won't, and we'll deal with that." He looked at her. "You handled it right." "I wasn't sure," she said honestly. "I might have been too direct." "Too direct is better than too indirect with Briggs. He respects direct." He paused. "He'll test it a few more times. He needs to see it hold." She nodded. She had expected as much. What she had not expected was that 3 days later, Briggs would come to her with a question about the supply order for March, not to Gideon, to her, and ask, without preamble or apparent discomfort, whether she wanted to adjust the quantities given what she'd found in the invoices. It was not an apology. It was not a capitulation. It was one professional asking another a practical question, and she answered it in exactly that spirit, and neither of them made anything more of it than that. When she told Gideon, he said, "I told you." "You did," she agreed. He looked pleased in the contained way he looked pleased, a slight easing around the eyes, nothing more. But the letter from Vivian's mother arrived in the 3rd week of February. It was long. Her mother wrote the way she talked, in full paragraphs that circled their point repeatedly before landing, with an undercurrent of worry dressed as practicality. The essential content was this: her father's health had declined, not critically, but noticeably. Her mother was concerned, and her mother was asking, in the careful language she'd developed over 30 years of asking things obliquely, whether Vivian might consider coming home to visit in the spring. Vivian read it twice and then set it down and looked at the window for a while. She had not been homesick exactly in the months she'd been in Wyoming. She missed Margaret Holloway. She missed the specific smell of the library at the Athenaeum. She missed the density of the city, the accumulated weight of 100,000 people making decisions and noise and history in a small area. She did not miss the parlor dinners or the performance of her social position or the careful work of being acceptable to people whose approval she didn't actually want. But her father was another matter. He had thought this was a mistake. He'd said so, though with the restraint of a man who knew his daughter would make her own choices regardless. He had been wrong about Gideon Mercer. She wanted, she realized, for him to know he'd been wrong. She wanted him to meet the man she'd married. She mentioned the letter to Gideon that evening. He read it carefully, the way he read everything. When he finished, he folded it along its original creases and handed it back. "Do you want to go?" he asked. "Not yet," she said. There's too much to do here in spring." "We'd manage." "I know you'd manage." She looked at the letter in her hands. "I don't want to go yet. I want him to come here." Gideon looked at her. "I want him to see this," she said. "The ranch. What we're building." She paused. "I want him to see you." He was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the wind moved across the roof. Not the brutal wind of deep winter, but something slightly less committed to destruction, which out here passed for a sign of spring. "Write and ask him," Gideon said. "He might say no. He's not well enough to travel. Then he says no, but ask him." She wrote the letter the following morning with the new pen he'd given her at Christmas, and she did not manage it or negotiate it or pitch it the way she'd pitched 100 things in her life. She just asked, plainly, if he would come to Wyoming in June and see what his daughter had made of herself out here. It was the most honest letter she'd written in years, possibly ever. The real winter arrived in early March. She had thought, naively, that February had been winter. February had been cold and hard and relentless. But it had been winter in the way a preliminary argument is a preliminary argument, real, but not yet the thing itself. The storm that came in the first week of March was something else. It announced itself 2 days early, the way the worst ones apparently did. Gideon told her this, with the matter-of-fact tone he used for things that were dangerous and couldn't be helped. The sky to the northwest went a specific color, he said, not quite gray, more like the sky had been drained of something, and the air changed quality, and the horses got restless in a way they didn't get restless for ordinary cold. He spent the day before the storm bringing extra feed into the barns, checking the stock, making sure the water lines wouldn't freeze solid. She helped, and he didn't suggest she shouldn't. They worked alongside each other through most of the day, and by the time they came in at dusk, with the first flakes starting sideways in the rising wind, she was tired in the satisfying way of having done something genuinely useful. The storm lasted 3 days. On the second day, the drifts came up past the lower windows on the north side of the house, and the wind was loud enough that they had to raise their voices to be heard across the room. Gideon made 4 trips out to the barns in that, each time coming back with ice in his beard, and the kind of cold on him that took 20 minutes by the stove to leave. She had coffee ready each time, and food, and she did not say anything about the danger because it needed to be done, and saying something about it would not help, and would only burden him with having to reassure her. On the third day, the wind dropped and the storm settled into a steady, heavy snowfall that went on for hours, and by the time it stopped, the world outside was unrecognizable. The fences were buried. The road to Casper was gone. The near pasture was a featureless white slope that made it hard to say where the ground was. Gideon stood on the porch that evening, looking out at it. "How long until the road's passable?" she asked. "Week, maybe, if it doesn't blow again." She leaned on the porch rail beside him. The cold was sharp and clean after the trapped air of the house, and the sky had cleared and the stars were very bright and very numerous and very far away. "The cattle on the east pasture?" she asked. "I need to check them tomorrow. I couldn't get out there during the storm. He was looking at the tree line, invisible under the snow. The drift patterns east of the barn concern me. There's a section of fence that runs close to the creek. If the drifting was bad enough, some of the young ones might have pushed through it. I can ride east in the morning, she said. You'll need to be here for the barns. He looked at her. Nell knows that ground, she said. I've ridden it a dozen times, and I'll take the rope line. The fence post line on the east side, I can follow it out and back. He was quiet for a moment. It's 3 miles to that section. I know how far it is. He looked at the tree line again. She could see him running the calculation. The morning tasks in the barns, the need to check the far cattle, the available people to do both things. Stay on the fence line going and coming back, he said. I will. If the creek looks like it's got weak ice anywhere near the crossings, you don't cross. You come back and tell me. Understood. He turned to go back inside and then stopped. Take the canvas pack on the back hook, he said. There's rope in it and a blanket, just to have. She nodded. He went inside and she stood on the porch a moment longer, looking at the cold white world. And she felt something that was not quite fear, but was something adjacent to it, a clear-eyed awareness of what this place could do, which was different from the abstract awareness she'd had in November when she'd first arrived. She understood it more personally now. The land out here was not hostile. It was simply indifferent, and indifference at this scale had consequences. She went inside and went to bed and slept without difficulty, which she recognized as a mark of how much she'd changed in 4 months. She left at first light. Gideon was already in the near barn when she saddled Nell. He came to the barn door and watched her check the girth and adjust the canvas pack on the back of the saddle, and he didn't say anything additional, which she appreciated. She'd already said she understood the conditions. She didn't need them repeated. Nell moved well through the snow, picking her way with the careful intelligence of a horse that knew the land and trusted it up to a point. The morning was cold and absolutely still. The post-storm stillness that felt different from ordinary quiet, something more complete, as though the world was holding its breath after the exertion. Her breath came in small clouds. The light on the snow was white and flat. She followed the east fence line the way Gideon had told her to, keeping the posts in sight, counting them the way she'd learned in November. The snow had drifted badly in places, waist-high on the north side of every fence section, while the south side was scoured almost clean. And she understood for the first time, physically, what a drift pattern like this did to cattle that didn't know to stay out of the low ground. She found the first group of young cattle about 1.5 miles out, huddled in the lee of a small rise, which was approximately where they were supposed to be. She counted them, all present. She turned Nell east again. The second group was at the far end of the east pasture, near the creek crossing. She found them in worse condition, thinner drift shelter, 2 of the younger ones with ice matted in their coats, but standing, all of them, which was what mattered. She counted carefully, 1 short. She looked around. The tree line along the creek was 30 yards north. She should have gone back. She knew, even at the time, with the clear part of her mind that always knew the right thing, that one missing yearling in a herd of 40 was not worth what came next. She knew it. But she pushed Nell toward the tree line anyway, scanning the snow for tracks, and she found them. A single set of small hoof prints heading toward the creek, blown partially over but still readable. She followed them into the trees. The creek crossing she knew, she'd used it a dozen times, was 40 yards east of where the tracks led her. The tracks led her to a different place, a bend in the creek where the bank was lower, and the cattle sometimes crossed in summer when the water was down. In summer it was fine. In March, after a hard winter, with 3 days of heavy snow and temperature swings that had thawed and refrozen the surface repeatedly, it was something else entirely. She saw the yearling on the far bank, standing in a small patch of brush, looking back at her with the particular blank stoicism of cattle that have gotten themselves into trouble and have no idea how to get out. She looked at the ice. It looked solid. It looked the same as the ice she'd crossed at the regular crossing a dozen times. She hesitated. Later, she would not be able to say exactly what calculation she ran in that moment, whether she genuinely believed the ice was safe or whether she knew it wasn't and crossed anyway. What she would remember was the stillness of the morning and the yearling standing on the far bank and the sound of absolute silence in the trees. She put Nell onto the ice. They made it 4 steps before it went. Not gradually, not with warning. The ice simply stopped holding, and Nell went through it with a sound that was enormous in the quiet of the trees. And the cold that came up was a different thing entirely from the cold of the air. It hit every part of Vivian at once, like a wall closing in. And Nell was scrambling, and Vivian was off the saddle chest and then her shoulder, and she caught the near bank edge with both hands and pulled. And the footing was mud and ice, and she pulled again and got one knee onto the bank, and then she was out. Nell found the bank 12 feet upstream, heaving and blowing, shaking water and ice from her coat, and came to stand near Vivian with the trembling, wide-eyed energy of a horse that has been badly frightened and doesn't yet know if it's over. Vivian sat on the bank in the mud and ice and tried to breathe. The cold was already doing what cold does. Not the pain she'd expected, but a strange numbness that moved fast up her arms and into her chest, and she'd read enough, had enough education, to understand exactly what that meant and how quickly it could progress. She got up. Her legs felt wrong already, the muscles thick and unresponsive, like working machinery that had been left out overnight. She caught Nell's reins. She looked at the far bank. The yearling was still there. She left the yearling. She turned Nell back toward the ranch and got into the saddle. It took 3 attempts, her hands already losing fine coordination. And she pointed Nell west and said out loud, to herself or to the horse, or to no one in particular, "Move." Nell moved. The ride back was 3 miles. She knew this. She kept knowing it, holding the number in her mind the way you hold a lamp in a dark room, something to navigate by. 3 miles. Nell knew the way. She only had to stay on. The cold deepened as they went. It was not painful anymore. That was the problem. She knew enough to know that not painful was worse than painful, that the absence of pain out here in wet clothes and sub-zero air meant her body was making decisions she hadn't authorized. She kept moving her toes inside her boots. She wasn't sure they were moving. She told herself they were. She thought about the ranch, the stove, the table with the lamp on it at 3 in the morning. She thought about Gideon at the table, reading, not looking up until she came down the stairs. She thought about the letter she'd sent her father. The tree line thinned and the open ground of the east pasture opened up ahead, and she could see the fence line, and beyond it the far dark line of the ranch buildings against the white sky. She heard herself say something, though she wasn't sure what. Nell picked up her pace without being asked, and the ranch buildings grew slowly larger, and the cold was enormous and complete, and all she had to do was stay on the horse. She was still on the horse when she reached the yard. She was not entirely sure she was still herself when she got there. She was aware of the yard, the barn door open, Gideon coming out of the barn and stopping when he saw her, stopping completely for one brief second before he started moving fast, the fastest she'd ever seen him move, crossing the yard toward her, and she tried to say something to him. The creek, or I fell, or just his name, but what came out wasn't any of those things, and then she wasn't on the horse anymore. He caught her before she reached the ground. She was aware of his arms and his voice, close and low, saying something she couldn't hold on to, and then the cold outside gave way to the cold inside, which was different and darker. And she thought, clearly, absurdly, in the last clear moment before everything went dim, that he had very warm hands for a man who worked outside. Then she didn't think anything for a while. She came back to herself in pieces. The first thing was warmth. Not comfortable warmth, but the aggressive, almost painful warmth of a body being pulled back from somewhere it had started going, heat pressing in from every direction like something insisting on her attention. The second thing was the smell of wood smoke and coffee and the particular combination of leather and cold air that she had, without realizing it, come to associate specifically with this house. The third thing was pain in her hands and feet, a deep, angry throbbing that she understood, distantly, was a good sign. Pain meant the blood was coming back. She opened her eyes. The ceiling of the downstairs room, the fire in the stove going hard, the damper wide open, more heat than it usually produced. She was on the narrow settle near the stove, wrapped in what appeared to be every blanket in the house, and she was wearing dry clothes that were not hers. A heavy flannel shirt, wool trousers that were too long, thick socks. Someone had changed her out of the wet things. She turned her head. Gideon was sitting in the chair pulled close to the settle, elbows on his knees, watching her. He looked. She searched for the right word and found it. Wrecked. Not injured. Wrecked. The kind of look a person had after something had frightened them very badly, and the fright had not yet finished its work. His coat was still on. He had not, she realized, been sitting here waiting. He had been sitting here refusing to leave. "There she is," he said. His voice was low and careful, the way you'd speak near something that might startle. She tried to say something and found her throat dry and raw. She swallowed. "How long?" she managed. "About 2 hours." He reached to the small table beside him, where there was a cup, and he held it out to her. She tried to take it, and her hands were shaking badly enough that he kept hold of it, steadied it with her, until she had a grip. The liquid was warm broth, not coffee. She noticed this and understood the choice, the practicality of it, not what she'd have wanted, but what she needed. She drank. "The creek crossing," she said. "I followed a yearling to the lower bend." "I know. I found the tracks." His jaw worked slightly. "Nell came back before you did. I was saddling up." She looked at him over the rim of the cup. He'd been about to come after her. She had beaten him by however narrow a margin. "She made it back all right?" she asked. "Nell. She's fine. Eddie's with her." He paused. "The yearling came back on its own by the time I went out. Walked through the break in the ice and found solid footing downstream." She closed her eyes briefly. "Of course it did." "Yeah." She heard something in that single word. Not anger, not yet, or not only that. Something that had been compressed down for 2 hours and was only now beginning to find any edges. "I should have turned back when I found the lower crossing," she said. "You should have." "I knew the ice might not hold." "Did you?" "The rational part of me did." She looked at him. "I don't have a better explanation than that." He was quiet for a moment. He looked at his hands, then back at her. "I need you to tell me you understand what almost happened out there." "I understand it." "Vivian." His voice had something underneath it now, something that cost him something to keep level. "That cold, the time you were in that water. If Nell hadn't brought you back, if you'd had to walk—" He stopped. "You would have been dead a mile from here." The plainness of it landed on her fully, and she let it. She didn't deflect from it or reframe it or find the logical angle that made it more manageable. She sat with the full weight of it the way he was sitting with it. "I know," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the stove. His hands, still clasped between his knees, tightened once and released. "Don't do that again," he said. "I won't. I'm not asking you to stop writing out. I'm asking you to—" He pressed his lips together. "Use the judgment you have, because you have good judgment. You had it that morning. You just didn't use it." She looked at him. The fire made its small sounds. Outside, the post-storm silence was complete and white and absolute. "You were scared," she said. He looked back at her. "Yes," he said. Just that. She had not heard him say that word. Not about anything. In 4 months. He wasn't a man who named his fear easily. She understood the cost of it, how much had to be at stake before it would come out that plainly. "I'm sorry," she said. "I mean that." He nodded once. Slowly. The compression in him eased by some small degree. "Can you sit up?" he asked. "I think so." He helped her, one hand at her back, steadying without pulling, and she got upright and the room tilted only briefly before it settled. Her hands were still shaking, but less. The throbbing in her feet was still there, but less savage than it had been. She looked down at the wool socks and the flannel shirt. "You changed my clothes," she said. "You were soaked through. You would have stayed hypothermic." A pause. I kept my eyes on the floor as much as I could. She looked at him. He was looking at the stove, his expression perfectly neutral, and there was something so genuinely awkward in that neutrality, so human in its discomfort, that she felt something move in her chest that was almost laughter, and was also something else entirely. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me for that." "I'm going to anyway." He glanced at her then, and she thought she saw, very briefly, the look of a man who had been scared and was now beginning to be relieved, and the relief was, in its way, harder to look at than the fear. She slept for most of the rest of that day. Gideon stayed in the house, which he rarely did during daylight hours. She was aware of this even through the drowsiness, heard him moving around downstairs, heard the low voices of him and Eddie at the back door at some point, heard the stove being fed. When she woke fully in the late afternoon, the light through the upstairs window was already going gray, and she lay still for a while, looking at the ceiling, taking stock. Her hands had stopped shaking. Her feet still ached, but the deep, angry throbbing had settled to something duller and more manageable. Her throat was sore. She felt, in the comprehensive way of someone who had been through something significant, like she had been emptied out and not yet refilled. She also felt, with a clarity that the emptied-out quality somehow made sharper, that there were things she had been not saying for 4 months that needed saying. Not tomorrow, not when the moment was perfect. The moment was never perfect, and she was done waiting for it. She came downstairs. Gideon was at the table with his notebook, though he wasn't writing in it. He was sitting with a pen in his hand and the notebook open and his gaze somewhere past the page. He looked up when she came down. "You should still be sleeping," he said. "I slept enough." She crossed to the stove and poured coffee and came to the table and sat down across from him. She wrapped both hands around the cup. "I need to tell you something." He set down the pen, gave her his full attention the way he always did, not leaning back, not preparing a response, just present. She looked at the cup for a moment and then at him. "When I stepped off the train in Casper," she said, "and I saw you on the platform, I made a decision about you in about 30 seconds. I decided you were not the man who wrote those letters. I decided the man who wrote those letters was someone I had invented, and the man on the platform was the truth, and the truth was a disappointment." She paused. "I spent the first 2 weeks here looking for evidence to support that decision." He didn't say anything. He wasn't surprised. She had known, back in November, that he'd already understood this. But there was a difference between understanding something and hearing it said plainly, and she was saying it plainly because anything less wouldn't be honest. "I was wrong," she said, "about almost everything I decided in those first 30 seconds. The man who wrote the letters is the man sitting across this table." She looked at him steadily. "You're exactly who you presented yourself to be, and I walked in here ready to disbelieve it, and I spent weeks looking for the version of you that matched my first impression, instead of looking at what was actually in front of me." A pause. "That's not—" She stopped. "I'm not proud of it." He looked at her for a long moment. The fire in the stove, the lamp on the table between them, the sound of the horses moving in the near barn, audible faintly through the wall. "I knew," he said. "I know you knew." "From the platform," he said. "The way you looked at me." He turned the pen once in his fingers. "I thought about it a fair amount, actually, before you arrived. What it would be like for someone to come from Philadelphia and find—" He gestured vaguely at the room, meaning the ranch, the territory, himself. "I thought I'd prepared myself for it. Turns out there's a difference between knowing something will happen and having it happen." She looked at him. "It hurt," she said. Not a question. He considered it the way he considered most things, honestly, without rushing to the comfortable answer. "Some," he said. "Mostly I just—" A pause. "I'd read your letters enough times that I felt like I knew you, and then I could see you looking at me and deciding you didn't know me at all." He looked at the table. That part was hard. She felt that fully, the way it deserved to be felt. "I'm sorry," she said, "for the platform, for the first 2 weeks, for planning in the back of my mind how to leave." He looked up. "You were planning to leave." "Not past the first month, but in the first 3 weeks. Yes." She held his gaze. "I think you should know that." He was quiet for a moment, processing this. "But you didn't." "No." "Why not?" She thought about it. The real answer, not the manageable one. "Because I kept finding out I was wrong," she said. "Every time I'd found what I thought was the evidence I was looking for, the version of you that justified leaving, I'd find out I'd missed something. The books, the conversation, the way you disagreed with me without diminishing me." She paused. "You kept not being what I'd decided you were." The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but what lived next to one. "That must have been inconvenient," he said. "Profoundly," she said. He looked at her across the table with that open expression, the one she'd spent months learning to read. And now she could read it fully. It wasn't reserve. It had never been reserve. It was a man who had been let down enough times to have learned patience as a survival skill, who had learned not to lean too hard on anything until he knew it would hold. I have to tell you something too, he said. She waited. I knew you might not stay. He set the pen down flat on the notebook. I knew when I first answered your letter, when I decided to answer your letter, that there was a real chance this would go the way you've described, that you'd come out here and look at me in the ranch and decide you'd made a mistake and go back. He paused. I thought about telling you more in the letters, what I looked like, what the place really was. Prepare you better. Why didn't you? He thought about it. Because I wanted you to come out here with an honest picture of me, he said. The parts of me that matter, and those parts were in the letters. He looked at the table. I figured if the rest of it, the coat, the beard, the 14 miles of bad road, if that was enough to make you leave, then it would have been the wrong fit anyway. A pause. That sounds colder than I mean it. No, she said. It makes sense. I cared whether you stayed, he said. I don't want you to think I was indifferent to it. I cared very much. I just decided that trying to manage your first impression, shape what you saw before you saw it, that wasn't something I was willing to do. He looked at her directly. If you stayed, I wanted it to be because of what was real. She sat with that. 4 months of accumulation, every small revision, every late evening, every argument that had ended somewhere instead of just stopping, arranged itself around that sentence and held it. I stayed, she said. You did. Nearly went under a frozen creek doing it, but I stayed. He let out a breath, short, involuntary, the sound of a man releasing something he'd been holding for several hours, and she realized that was the closest thing to a laugh she'd heard from him, and she found she wanted to hear it again. That part wasn't required, he said. I'm aware of that now. He looked at her and she looked at him, and something that had been building since November, something that had been patient and careful and constructed piece by piece out of everything real between them, settled into place without ceremony. Gideon, she said. Yeah. Come sit over here. He looked at the other side of the settle for a moment. Then he picked up his coffee and moved to sit beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched, and she leaned into him slightly. Not dramatically, not with performance, just the weight of a person who has been cold for a long time finding something warm. He didn't move away. He sat still, and after a moment he turned his head and pressed his mouth to her hair, briefly, like something he'd thought about for a while and had finally decided to stop not doing. They sat that way while the fire went on, and the cold pressed at the walls, and the night came down over the Wyoming territory. Two people who had come to each other by the long way around and had arrived somewhere neither of them could have described precisely, but both of them could feel. Damn. The following days had a different quality to them. Not easier exactly. The ranch work did not become easier. The cold did not relent. The daily inventory of problems that needed solving did not shrink. But something in the house itself changed, some quality of the air between the two of them, and both of them knew it, and neither of them called unnecessary attention to it. She moved through her recovery at the pace the recovery dictated, rather than the pace she wanted, which was faster. Gideon enforced this without fanfare. He simply did not hand her the heavy things, did not leave the barn work for her for 4 days, and when she pointed out on day 3 that she was perfectly capable of walking to the near barn and back, he looked at her with the expression that she'd come to recognize as his version of immovability, and said, 2 more days. And she argued, and he waited out the argument, and she took the 2 days. On the 5th day, she went back to the full work of the ranch, and it felt like herself returning to herself, which was a feeling she hadn't known she could miss until she'd missed it. Tom Briggs, to his credit, said nothing about the creek incident beyond a gruff and somewhat awkward acknowledgement the first morning she was back in the yard. "Glad you're up, Mrs. Mercer," which from Briggs was the equivalent of a considerable speech, and she thanked him for it in exactly the measure he'd offered it, and they moved on, which was the only way to handle anything with Briggs, and by now she knew it. The letter from her father arrived in the 3rd week of March. He would come in June, he wrote. His health was better than her mother's letters had suggested. She suspected her mother had been, characteristically, managing the presentation. He was curious about Wyoming. He wrote, in the careful language she knew he used when he was saying something that mattered to him. I was not wrong about your intelligence and your capability, Vivian. I was wrong to believe that those qualities required Philadelphia to be properly expressed. A father should know better than to confuse the place with the person. She read this at the table with her coffee and sat with it for a long time. She showed it to Gideon that evening. He read it and handed it back and said, "He sounds like a man who knows how to admit when he's wrong." "He does," she said. "It took him a long time to learn it, but he learned it." Gideon looked at her steadily. "I'm looking forward to meeting him," he said, and he meant it, which she could tell because Gideon Mercer did not say things he didn't mean. "He'll like you," she said. "Eventually." "Eventually," he repeated. "He's cautious about new people. He'll watch you for a while first." "That seems reasonable," Gideon said. "You'd think that," she said. In the first days of April, the land agent from Cheyenne wrote back with a revised offer on the 40-acre parcel. The original seller had received another inquiry, and the price had moved. Not dramatically, but enough to matter. Vivian did the calculation the same evening and showed it to Gideon. They sat at the table and went through it together, the way they did everything now. Neither of them leading, both of them working the problem, pushing back and conceding and adjusting until they arrived at something that was better than either of them would have reached alone. The revised numbers still made sense. The spring drive terms from Cheyenne had come in solid, better than the previous year. The margin was thinner than they wanted, but it was there. "Do we do it?" she asked. He looked at the numbers for a moment longer. "Yes," he said. "You're sure?" He looked at her. "I've been thinking about that 40 acres for 3 years," he said. "I was waiting until I had someone I trusted to help me decide if it made sense." A pause. "Now I do." She looked back at the numbers so he wouldn't see what that sentence did to her face. "I'll draft the response," she said. "I know you will," he said, and she could hear in his voice the things she was hiding in hers, and she thought that was all right. Some things didn't need to be made explicit. They were understood, the way the fence line was understood, the way the mountains to the west were understood. Not discussed, just part of the true shape of things. She picked up the pen and began. The response to the land agent went out on a Tuesday, and by the end of April, the 40-acre parcel was theirs. Gideon rode the new ground the first morning after the paperwork came through, and Vivian rode with him. They didn't talk much. There wasn't a great deal to say that the land itself wasn't already saying. The creek that ran along the northeast corner moved clear and cold over a gravel bed, which meant reliable summer water, which meant something specific and valuable on this side of the territory. The pasture ground was rougher than the land agent's description had been perfectly honest about, but it was workable, and the fence line that needed closing was less extensive than Gideon had feared. He stood at the edge of the creek and looked across their land, and she watched him do it. The look on his face was not triumph. It was something quieter and more durable than that. The look of a man who had been working towards something for a long time and had finally put his hand on it. 3 more years, he said. We'll have enough water access to run a bigger herd through summer without supplementing. 2.5, she said, if the spring drive margins hold. He looked at her sideways. 2.5, he said. She didn't say anything. She looked at the creek and the new grass starting along its banks, pale green and tentative, the first real color in the landscape since October. Spring was arriving the way it apparently always arrived in Wyoming, late and reluctant and all at once, as though it had been somewhere else and had only now remembered it had obligations. She thought about what she'd written in her letter to Margaret Holloway in late March. I don't fully recognize the version of myself I was a year ago. Not in a dramatic way. More like, I look back at that woman on the train platform and I understand her and I don't dismiss her, but I can see that she was working from a very incomplete map. The territory is larger than the map was. Margaret had written back, that either means you're wiser or you've been west too long. I suspect both. She thought Margaret was probably right on both counts. Her father arrived on the 3rd of June. He was thinner than she remembered, which her mother had not mentioned, and he moved more carefully than the man who had walked with her through the Athenaeum on Sunday mornings when she was 12 years old. But his eyes were the same, careful, intelligent, the eyes of a man who read what was in front of him rather than what he decided to see. She had always loved that about him. She had always tried to be more like him in that specific way, and had not always managed it. He stood in the yard and looked at the house, the barns, the long open ground of the valley running east, the mountains to the west still white at the top, even in June, and he was quiet for a long moment. "It's real," he said finally. She wasn't sure what he meant exactly, and so she said, "What did you expect?" He looked at her. "I don't know. Something less," he gestured at the mountains, "less actual than this." Gideon came out of the near barn at that moment, not staged, just the coincidence of timing, and crossed the yard in his usual way, steady and unhurried. He'd put on a clean shirt for the arrival, which she'd noticed and not commented on. He had not, however, done anything about the beard, which she'd also noticed. He shook her father's hand, and her father looked at him the way Gideon had predicted he would, assessing, cautious, taking his time. "Mr. Ashcroft," Gideon said, "I hope the journey wasn't too long." Her father glanced at Vivian briefly, something flickering in his expression that she couldn't quite read. Then back to Gideon. "3 days?" he said. It was adequate. She looked away before either of them could see her face. The 2 weeks of her father's visit were not effortless. Nothing real was effortless, and she was done expecting things to be. Her father was a careful man, and Gideon was a private one, and the two of them negotiated the early days with a politeness that was genuine, but had a quality of mutual assessment underneath it that neither of them was trying very hard to conceal. She let them find their own footing. She'd learned over the past months that the most useful thing she could do in a situation where two people needed to arrive at an understanding was to stop managing the arrival. The shift came on the 5th day, when her father asked to see the ledgers. She hadn't expected this. Her father had been a businessman in Philadelphia. Dry goods, moderately successful, practical in the way of men who'd started with little and built something through specific competence rather than inherited advantage. When she brought the ledgers out and spread them on the table, he put on his reading glasses and went through them with the attention of a man who understood what he was looking at. Gideon sat across this table and answered his questions. Her father's questions were good, specific, financial, the kind that went for the structural truth of a thing rather than its appearance. Gideon answered them in the same spirit, directly, without overselling or deflecting, acknowledging the vulnerabilities as plainly as the strengths. After an hour of this, her father looked up from the ledgers and said, "My daughter found the pricing problem with your Casper buyer?" "She did," Gideon said, "and renegotiated the contract. She drafted the correspondence. We went through it together." Her father looked at her across the table, then back at Gideon. "She was wasted in Philadelphia," he said. "I know that," Gideon said. A silence. Her father took off his reading glasses and folded them slowly. "So do I," her father said. Now. It was not an apology in the explicit sense, but she knew her father, and she understood the weight of what he'd just said, the specific cost of a man admitting to another man about his own daughter that he had underestimated her. She looked down at the table. Something in her chest tightened and released. That evening after dinner, her father sat on the porch with Gideon while she cleared the table, and she could hear them through the open window. Not the words, just the rhythm of two voices in conversation, and the conversation had a different quality than the previous 4 days. Less careful, more actual. She stood at the window for a moment with a dish in her hand and listened to the sound of it, and she felt something she had not expected to feel, something that was, in its quiet way, a kind of completion. Before he left, her father pulled her aside on the last morning while Gideon was loading his bags into the wagon. "He's a good man," her father said. "Yes," she said. "I mean," he stopped. Her father was not a man who said things twice, usually. The fact that he was working at this told her something. "I mean, he's genuinely good, not performed, not strategic." He looked at Gideon across the yard. "That's rarer than people think." "I know," she said. "I know that now." He put his hand on her arm, briefly, the gesture he'd used since she was small, when he wanted to say something he didn't have precise words for. Then he walked to the wagon, and she stood in the June sun of the Wyoming yard and watched him go. The years that followed were not a straight line because nothing worth anything ever was. There were good years and hard years, and the hard ones were genuinely hard in the way that life on the frontier was hard. Not picturesque hardship, not the kind that resolved cleanly, but the grinding, ordinary difficulty of weather and market prices and equipment that broke at the wrong time, and animals that died and decisions that turned out wrong despite being made carefully. In the summer of 1887, a drought cut their hay yield by a third, and they had to sell down the herd earlier than planned. Vivian spent 3 weeks in August going over the numbers every which way and could not find an arrangement that wasn't costly, and she told Gideon so at the kitchen table on a Thursday evening, and he looked at the numbers and said, "I know. We sell the animals, and we take the loss, and we rebuild next year." And that was what they did. In the spring of 840 acres flooded badly, the worst in anyone's recent memory, and they lost 2 weeks of grazing and a section of new fencing and a piece of equipment that had been wrong stored near the creek bank. Gideon came in that evening and sat down and was quiet for a long time. And she sat with him and didn't try to immediately fix the silence, because she'd learned by then that some silences needed to be sat in rather than solved. Eventually he said, "I should have moved that equipment last fall." "Yes," she said, because it was true and he knew it, and there was no use in pretending otherwise. "That's $200. "I know." He looked at his hands. "I should have moved it." "You should have," she said. "And next fall you will. And so will I. And we won't lose $200 that way again." She paused. "That's how it works." He looked at her. "That's how all of it works," she said. "You do a thing wrong, and it costs you something real, and then you don't do it wrong the same way twice." She held his gaze. "You've taught me that. You've been teaching me that since November of 1885. He was quiet for a moment. "You could argue you taught me a version of the same thing," he said. "I know I did," she said. "That's my point." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, briefly, the way he did when something mattered to him and the words for it were somewhere he couldn't quite reach. She turned her hand and held his. They rebuilt the fence that summer and moved the equipment in September and did not lose it again. Daniel Mercer came to visit in 1890. Whitmore had resolved his debt situation in full by the end of 1886. The original terms had been reinstated, and the creditor, facing an actionable fraud claim, had settled for the amount actually owed and had not pressed further. Daniel had spent the intervening years rebuilding, and when he came to Wyoming, he was thinner than his brother, but had the same quality of steadiness, the same directness, and he spent the first day of his visit following Vivian around the ranch, asking her questions about the operation with an attention and respect that she recognized. It was his brother's attention, his brother's particular quality of listening. Over dinner on the second night, he said, "Gideon wrote me early on, after you'd been here maybe 2 months. Said you'd found the pricing problem with the Casper buyer and you'd renegotiated the contract." Vivian looked at Gideon across the table. He was working on a piece of bread and not meeting her eyes, which told her he'd known this story was coming. "He didn't tell me that," she said. "He told me you were the most useful person he'd ever worked with," Daniel said, "and that he wasn't entirely sure what to do about it." "That's enough," Gideon said. He also said, "Daniel." Daniel looked at his brother with the expression of a younger sibling who had been told to stop and was weighing the cost of continuing. He appeared to decide the cost was acceptable. "He said you had a way of being right about things that somehow didn't make you insufferable about it," he said to Vivian. He found that unusual, and it concerned him. She looked at Gideon, who was looking at the table with the expression of a man who was accepting the consequences of a letter he'd written 9 years ago and had apparently said more in than he'd intended. "Concerned you?" she said. He looked up. "I was being honest with my brother," he said. "I didn't expect a full recitation at dinner." "He's been waiting 9 years to use it," she said. 8, Daniel said. "I forgot about it for about a year in there." Gideon looked at his brother with the flat patience of a man who had spent a lifetime being the older sibling and had not found it easier with practice. "The ranch looks good," Daniel said cheerfully, refilling his coffee. "Really good. Whatever you're both doing, keep doing it." She looked at Gideon across the table. He looked back at her. Something passed between them. The accumulated weight of 9 years of seasons, the shared language of two people who had built something real out of something uncertain. And she thought, not for the first time, that she would take this man and this table and this difficult, beautiful, unforgiving territory over any version of her Philadelphia life without a second's hesitation. She raised her coffee cup slightly toward him. He raised his back, almost imperceptibly, and that was enough. Tom Briggs retired in the autumn of 1893 on account of a knee that had been giving him trouble for 2 years and had finally made its position on continued fence work non-negotiable. He came to the house on his last day. Vivian was at the table, as she often was in the mornings, going over the season's final accounts, and he stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands and looked at her with the expression of a man who has something to say and has spent a while deciding whether to say it. "Mrs. Mercer," he said. "Tom," she said. "Sit down." He sat, which surprised her. He usually conducted conversations from the doorway, as though maintaining exit access was important. "I wasn't easy on you when you came," he said. She looked at him steadily. "No. I thought—" He turned his hat in his hands. "I had a way of thinking about how things worked out here, what the ranch needed, what Mr. Mercer needed." He paused. "I was wrong about the second one." She waited. "He needed someone who'd push back on him," Briggs said. "I never did. I just did what he said, and I thought that was loyalty." He looked at the hat. "But you'd argue with him about a grazing rotation at 10 o'clock at night, and somehow the ranch was better for it the next morning. I couldn't—" He stopped. "It took me a while to understand that." "It took me a while too," she said, "to understand what I was looking at when I got here." He glanced up. "We both had pictures in our heads that didn't match what was real," she said. "Yours took longer to update than mine, that's all." He looked at her for a moment with something in his face that was not gratitude exactly, but the thing that sits next to gratitude when a person isn't accustomed to being offered a way out of their own worst behavior. "You're generous about it," he said. "I'm practical about it," she said. "You became one of the best hands this ranch has had. Generous is when you give something for free. Practical is when you acknowledge what something was actually worth." He nodded slowly, stood, put his hat back on. "Take care of yourself, Tom," she said. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and walked out. And she watched through the window as he crossed the yard one last time, and she thought about the specific way that trust was built between people who had no natural reason to give it. Slowly, through evidence, through consistency, through the willingness to be wrong out loud. And she thought that this was perhaps the most important thing the territory had taught her. Not the ledgers, not the weather, not the fence lines. The trust. Gideon Mercer died on a Thursday morning in early April of 1921. He had been ill for the better part of a year. His heart, the doctor in Casper had said, the language careful in the way medical language was careful when it meant something irreversible. He had managed it the way he managed everything, without drama, without excessive complaint, with the steady practical attention of a man who had always understood that some problems could be solved and some could only be endured, and the job was knowing the difference. He died in the bed upstairs, in the room that had been his alone for the first 6 weeks of their marriage, and had been theirs for the 35 years after that. She was with him. She had been with him through the night, and at some point in the gray early morning she must have slept, because she came awake to a quality of stillness in the room that was different from sleep. And she knew. She sat with that for a while. She did not rush it. Later, when the practical things had been done and the people had come and gone, and the house was quiet again, she went to the hook behind the back door where he'd kept his old canvas coat, the one he'd been wearing on the platform in Casper in November of 1885, the brown one with the left elbow patched with a different material, the collar that turned up against the wind. She had washed it twice over the years and repaired the other elbow herself, and suggested, probably a dozen times, that he might consider replacing it. He'd kept it anyway, moving it from hook to hook as the years had changed the shape of their life and the shape of the house. She took it down from the hook and held it for a long time. She thought about a woman on a train platform 36 years ago making a decision about a man in 30 seconds. She thought about all the things that woman had been right about and all the things she'd been wrong about, and the fact that the things she'd been wrong about had turned out to be the most important ones. She thought about how close she had come, in those first weeks, in her careful private inventory of escape routes, to missing all of it, all 35 years of it. Every argument and every late night and every season that had been hard and every one that hadn't been. She thought about what it cost, a first impression. How much it could take from you if you let it. She thought about what it had taken to let go of hers. Not a single moment, not a dramatic reversal, but the long, slow accumulation of evidence until the original verdict couldn't hold anymore. She had needed to be shown. She was not proud of that. But she had been shown, eventually, and she had had the honesty to look at what was being shown to her and adjust. And she thought that adjusting, the willingness to be wrong, the willingness to look again, was perhaps the only real form of intelligence that mattered in the end. She put the coat back on the hook. She left it there. There were people who came in the following weeks and asked about the old coat behind the door, whether she wanted it packed away or disposed of. And she told them each time that it stayed where it was. Some of them understood and some of them didn't, and she found she had very little interest in explaining it to the ones who didn't. If you had to explain what a coat like that meant, the explanation would never be sufficient anyway. But by my moment, the ranch ran for another 12 years under her direct management, and then she brought in their son, Robert, who had grown up on this ground and understood it in his blood. And she stayed on in an advisory capacity that was somewhat more active than advisory suggested, a fact Robert accepted with the specific patience of a son who had grown up watching two people argue about grazing rotations at 10 o'clock at night and had concluded that this was simply how things worked. She wrote to Margaret Holloway until Margaret died in 1918, and she kept every letter Margaret had sent her, tied with a cord in the wooden box under the shelf where Gideon had kept the old ledgers. She wrote to Daniel Mercer in Baltimore regularly until the end of her life. She never went back to Philadelphia. She was not unhappy about this. She thought about it sometimes, not with regret, but with the clear-eyed interest she brought to most things, the way you examine a decision years after it was made to understand it better. She had left a life in Philadelphia that had been intelligent and comfortable and profoundly limiting, and she had come to a place that was hard and cold and enormous and had given her room to be fully what she was. It was not a trade she would have reversed. It was barely, when she examined it honestly, a trade at all. It was just what happened when you finally stopped arranging your life around what other people could tolerate and started arranging it around what was true. Gideon had known what was true about her before she knew it herself. She had needed months in a frozen creek and a long night by the fire to know it about him. Neither of them had been quick about it. Both of them had been, eventually, honest. That seemed like enough. In her last years, she sat on the porch in the evenings when the weather permitted, which it often didn't, because the weather in Wyoming had never acquired the habit of permitting things. She sat there anyway. She looked at the mountains to the west, still white at the top even in summer, the same mountains she'd seen for the first time from a wagon bench in November of 1885, when she'd been looking for a way back to where she'd come from. She understood something now that she hadn't understood then. The mountains had not changed. The territory had not changed. What had changed was the person looking at them, and the person looking at them had changed because she had been willing, slowly, stubbornly, reluctantly willing, to look at what was actually there instead of what she'd decided to see. There was a lesson in that. There was a lesson in all of it. She never wrote it down because she thought the people who needed it probably wouldn't find it in a written-down form anyway. It wasn't that kind of lesson. It was the kind you had to live into, the kind that only arrived through the specific experience of being wrong about something important and then being honest enough to know it. The woman who had stood on a train platform in Casper, Wyoming, in November of 1885 and wanted to get back on the train had spent the rest of her life grateful that she hadn't. Not because everything had been easy, not because she had found some flawless version of happiness that the stories promised, but because she had stayed long enough to find out what was real. And what was real had been worth every mile of the journey out.